What if the person you chose to forget your ex ended up becoming the reason you finally understood what love was supposed to feel like? She didn't walk into that bookstore looking for love. She walked in looking for revenge. She had a broken heart, a perfectly executed plan, and absolutely zero intention of feeling anything real ever again. He was just supposed to be a distraction. A beautiful, convenient, temporary distraction. Someone her ex would see, feel something about, and regret everything. That was the plan. But here's what nobody tells you about plans built on pain. They have a way of collapsing into something far more terrifying and far more beautiful than anything you could have designed. Because somewhere between the first coffee and the quiet museum afternoon, and the moment he held her hand without her asking, the plan dissolved. And what was left was real. What if the heart you were trying to protect from ever feeling again was already, quietly, without your permission, choosing someone new? What if the person you used to win a game your ex wasn't even playing, was actually the person the universe had been trying to introduce you to all along? This is the story of a woman who dated someone to cause pain and ended up finding her way home. Stay until the end, because the last thing she says will change the way you think about every love story you've ever called an accident. The night Aria deleted every photo of Daniel from her phone, she didn't cry. She poured herself a glass of wine she didn't finish, sat on the bathroom floor in a dress she'd bought specifically because he once said she looked beautiful in yellow, and stared at the blank wall until the feeling in her chest calcified into something harder than sadness. Something that felt dangerously close to a plan. She wasn't the type of woman who fell apart publicly. 4 years with Daniel had taught her many things: how to love someone completely, how to rearrange her entire identity around another person's preferences, and ultimately, how devastating it feels when that person looks at you one Tuesday evening and says, "I just don't feel it anymore, Aria. I'm sorry." He was sorry. She had replayed those words so many times that they'd lost all meaning, becoming just sounds, just vibrations, just evidence of how spectacularly she had miscalculated everything she believed about her own life. 3 weeks after the breakup, Daniel was already being spotted with someone new. A girl named Priya who worked in his office building, who had long dark hair and a laugh that apparently carried across entire restaurants. Aria knew this because their mutual friends had the emotional intelligence of middle schoolers and seemed constitutionally incapable of keeping information to themselves. She sat with that information for exactly 48 hours before she made the decision. She was going to make Daniel feel exactly what she was feeling. She was going to find someone, anyone, and she was going to make the most beautiful, convincing, Instagram-worthy love story out of thin air. And she was going to parade it directly in front of his face until his comfortable new life with Priya felt like standing barefoot on broken glass. The plan was, she had to admit, slightly unhinged. She executed it anyway. She found Zayan at a bookstore on a Wednesday afternoon. This was, in hindsight, either the universe's most elaborate joke or its most generous gift, and Aria still couldn't decide which. She had gone to the bookstore genuinely. She needed something to read because she'd spent 3 weeks staring at her bedroom ceiling, and her therapist had suggested, with the careful diplomacy of someone who'd been professionally trained not to say, "You need to get off your bathroom floor," that perhaps engaging with something creative might help. Aria had interpreted this as permission to browse fiction for 2 hours and spend money she didn't need to spend. She was reaching for a novel on the upper shelf, the kind of literary fiction that feels important without being particularly enjoyable, when someone reached past her at exactly the same moment, and their hands collided in that clumsy, slightly painful way that results in both people pulling back and saying sorry simultaneously. She looked up. He was tall in the specific way that becomes immediately inconvenient when you're already irritated at the universe. Dark hair slightly longer than fashionable, wearing a jacket that suggested he'd grabbed it without much thought, and somehow looked effortlessly correct in it. He had the kind of face that wasn't immediately, obviously handsome, but became increasingly difficult to look away from the longer you looked, which Aria registered with mild annoyance, because she was not in the market for noticing things about strangers' faces. "Sorry," he said again, and his voice was low and unhurried, in a way that felt oddly calming. "I was here first," Arya said, which was probably not the most socially graceful response, but was accurate. He looked at the book, looked at her, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "It's actually not very good," he said, nodding toward the novel. "I read it last year. The first 100 pages are brilliant, and then it completely abandons everything it promised." Arya blinked. "That's a very specific review to offer an absolute stranger." "You looked like you were about to make a committed decision," he said. "I felt responsible." She stared at him for a moment. In another version of her life, the version where Daniel hadn't dismantled everything 4 weeks ago, she would have laughed, taken the book anyway just to be contrary, and walked away. She had always been slightly suspicious of men who appeared convenient. But this was not that version of her life. This was the version where she had a plan, and Zayan, standing in the middle of a bookstore on a Wednesday afternoon with his slightly too long hair and his unsolicited literary opinions, was, she decided in approximately 4 seconds, going to be part of it. "I'm Arya," she said, and offered her hand the way you do when you've decided something. He shook it. His hand was warm. She filed this information away and ignored it. "Zayan, buy me coffee," she said, "and recommend me something that actually keeps its promises." He looked at her for a moment, just a beat longer than casual, as if he was reading something in her expression that she hadn't consciously put there. Then he smiled, and it was the kind of smile that arrived slowly and stayed. "All right," he said. The coffee became dinner. Arya hadn't planned for dinner. She had planned for approximately 90 minutes of charming, visible companionship that she could document strategically on social media, followed by a graceful exit and a congratulatory feeling about her own cleverness. Instead, she was still sitting across from Zayan at 8:30 in the evening, having consumed an amount of pasta she would later choose not to think about, laughing, genuinely laughing, at a story about the most catastrophically organized road trip he'd attempted with his university friends 6 years ago, which had ended with 2 of them stranded in a town whose name none of them could reliably pronounce, eating gas station sandwiches, and arguing about whether they were technically lost or merely locationally flexible. She had not thought about Daniel in approximately 2 hours. This was the longest she had managed this particular feat since the Tuesday he had broken her heart, and it registered somewhere below her conscious awareness as something significant. "You're not what I expected," she said, which she hadn't intended to say out loud. Zayan raised an eyebrow. "What did you expect?" She considered lying. It was, after all, the more sensible option. "Someone easier to dismiss," she admitted instead, and immediately wished she hadn't because it was too honest, and honesty was not part of the plan. He looked at her steadily. He had this quality, she was beginning to notice it, of giving conversations his complete, unhurried attention, as though whatever she was saying was the only thing happening in the world. It was simultaneously the most comfortable and the most destabilizing thing she had experienced in recent memory. "I'll take that," he said simply. She posted one photo that night, carefully angled, soft lighting. The kind of image that says, "I am absolutely thriving and not at all reassembling my entire personality from scratch." She tagged the restaurant. She did not tag Zayan because she had not asked his permission, and she had, it turned out, some lines she wouldn't cross, even in her most strategically unhinged moments. She checked her phone 17 times in the following hour. Daniel had not viewed it, or had viewed it and chosen not to react, which was somehow worse. She put her phone face down on her nightstand and stared at the ceiling, and told herself this was fine. This was all part of the plan, and the plan was working. It just needed more time. She thought, briefly and without permission, about the way Zayan's face changed when he talked about books he loved. A kind of unguarded enthusiasm that he didn't seem to notice or try to manage. She thought about this for longer than was strictly necessary. They went to a museum the following Saturday. This had been Zayan's suggestion, offered via text message 2 days after dinner. There's an exhibition on at the Contemporary Art Museum, photography mostly. I think you'd find it interesting. No pressure, obviously. The "no pressure, obviously" had done something peculiar to her chest that she had chosen to interpret as indigestion. She went. The exhibition was extraordinary. Raw documentary photography from a woman who had spent 15 years photographing communities in transition, entire neighborhoods captured in the moment of becoming something different from what they'd been. There was one photograph in particular that stopped Arya mid-step. A woman standing at the window of a house that was clearly in the process of being sold. One hand on the glass, expression unreadable, neither devastated nor relieved, just present in the middle of the leaving. Arya stood in front of it for a long time. She looks like she's trying to memorize it, Zayan said quietly from beside her. Or trying to figure out if she's going to miss it, Arya said. Or if she's just afraid of not missing it. A pause. She felt him look at her. That's a very specific thing to say, he said softly. You said the same thing to me in the bookstore. You remembered. I remember specific things, she said, still looking at the photograph. I'm not sure why I told you that. He didn't respond immediately. When she finally turned to look at him, he was watching her with that expression she was beginning to recognize. Careful, attentive, like someone reading a sentence twice to make sure they'd understood it correctly. I'm glad you did, he said. She looked away first. She saw Daniel 3 weeks into whatever this was with Zayan. It happened at a mutual friend's birthday dinner, the kind of social gathering that is technically optional, but functionally unavoidable when you've been part of the same friend group for 4 years, and leaving would feel like conceding something. Arya had known he might be there. She had, in fact, chosen her dress with this possibility in mind. She arrived with Zayan. This had not been the original plan. The original plan had involved looking effortlessly beautiful and emotionally healed while being technically alone, which was its own kind of statement. But Zayan had texted that afternoon asking if she wanted company, and she had said yes before she'd finished reading the message, which she had then spent 20 minutes attempting to analyze. Daniel was there, with Priya, who was, Arya noted with the specific objectivity of someone who is absolutely not being objective, genuinely lovely looking, with exactly the kind of warm, easy smile that suggested she had never once sat on a bathroom floor staring at a wall. Arya watched Daniel's face when he saw her. She watched him notice Zayan beside her. And then she watched him smile, a genuine, uncomplicated, perfectly civil smile, and raise his glass slightly in greeting, and turn back to Priya and continue his evening. That was it. No flicker of regret. No barely concealed devastation. No satisfying evidence that her plan had worked. Just a polite, pleasant acknowledgement from a man who had clearly, genuinely, completely moved forward. Arya stood very still for approximately 3 seconds. Zayan's hand found the small of her back, a light, unhurried touch, not possessive, just present. Are you all right? He asked quietly, close enough that only she could hear. She turned to look at him, and something shifted in her chest in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with Daniel. I think, she said slowly, I've been asking the completely wrong question. He looked at her, waiting. He was very good at waiting. I'll explain later, she said. He nodded, just nodded, trusted her with the later without demanding the now. She thought, standing in that crowded room with Daniel somewhere behind her and Zayan quietly solid beside her. When did the gravity change? When did she stop orbiting one person and start being pulled, without her permission or her planning, towards someone else entirely? She couldn't find the specific moment. It had been too gradual, too quiet, too honest. She told him on a Tuesday. She'd chosen Tuesday with a kind of private, bitter poetry. Tuesdays were when things ended, apparently, and maybe they were also when things could be said that couldn't be unsaid. They were walking along the riverbank after dinner. The evening was warm, and the city was doing its beautiful, indifferent thing of existing in golden light regardless of what anyone walking through it might be feeling. Zayan had his hands in his pockets and was talking about something, a book, she thought, or something he'd read, and Arya stopped walking. He stopped too, turned to look at her. "I have to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to know that I am not proud of it." He waited. She told him everything, from the bathroom floor to the bookstore, from the plan to the photo she'd posted that he'd never seen, from the specific calculation behind her first coffee invitation to the specific moment, somewhere between the museum and right now, when the calculation had dissolved into something that frightened her, because it was real. She did not look away from him while she spoke. She had decided that if she was going to say this, she was going to say it honestly, without the protection of evasion. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough to be painful. "How long ago did you know it was real?" he asked finally. She blinked. Of all the questions. "The museum," she said. "That photograph." "I knew something changed then," he said quietly. "You're not angry." "I didn't say that." "Zayan, I'm also not leaving," he said. He looked at her steadily, with that expression that undid her, the one that suggested he saw the thing she was actually saying beneath the thing she was saying. "I'm frustrated that I was a plan. I won't pretend I'm not. But here's what I also know. Every conversation we've had since that first coffee has been real. The way you look at things, the way you think, the way you stopped pretending to be fine around me about 3 weeks in and just started being honest without noticing." He paused. "I fell for the honest version, not the plan. So I need you to understand that what I feel is based on something that was never fake, even if you thought it was." Arya felt her throat tighten. "I was trying to hurt someone who had already stopped feeling," she said. "And I nearly missed someone who was right in front of me, actually paying attention." "You didn't miss me," he said. "I almost did." "Almost is the most important word in most love stories," he said. And the quiet certainty in his voice made her eyes sting in a way she hadn't given herself permission for in months. The whole story usually lives in the almost. She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she hadn't let herself fully look because looking felt like admitting something she wasn't ready for. She was ready now. "I'm sorry," she said. "For the beginning." "I know," he said. "I forgive you for the beginning." He took a slow step toward her. "I'm more interested in what comes next." The city moved around them. The river caught the last light. Arya, who had started this whole chapter of her life trying to rearrange someone else's emotions, found herself completely rearranged. She reached out and took his hand. He held it like he'd been waiting, and the strange, beautiful, ridiculous truth was this. She had walked into a bookstore with revenge in her heart, and walked out, eventually, with something that looked considerably more like the thing she'd actually been looking for all along. "I dated him to hurt my ex" is not simply a story about a revenge plan gone sideways. It is a story about what happens when we are so consumed by the pain of one ending that we stumble, completely accidentally, into a far more meaningful beginning. Arya's journey from heartbreak to manipulation to genuine love reveals one of the most confronting truths about human emotion. Healing rarely arrives through the doors we deliberately open. It sneaks in through the windows we forget to close. She began with a plan built on ego and pain, and ended with something built on honesty and vulnerability, two things she had stopped believing were available to her. Zion's response to her confession, choosing to stay, choosing the real over the origin, demonstrates that genuine love is not diminished by a complicated beginning. It is defined by what both people choose to do when the truth is finally on the table. The real love story here isn't between Arya and Zion. It's between Arya and her own capacity to stop performing and start feeling. That is always where love actually begins.